Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a place where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres guide you toward rest. Before tonight's story begins, you are warmly invited to share where you are listening from in the comments below. It is always a comfort to see this quiet community reaching across the world night by night, and if these stories bring you a sense of calm, you are welcome to subscribe and join us on these peaceful journeys. Now, take a moment to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or your favorite chair. Gently close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and allow the day to soften and fade. Let my voice carry you quietly into sleep, to a place where imagination drifts and rest comes naturally. It was not unusual, in that quarter of the city, for things to arrive late. Letters wandered, promises hesitated, even apologies seemed to lose their way between intention and delivery. Blackthorn Street, in particular, had long been accustomed to delay, as though time itself moved more cautiously there. Yet when the parcel was placed upon the narrow hall table of number 17, it carried with it a lateness of an entirely different character. The hall was long and restrained, its walls dressed in a once fashionable green paper, now faded into quiet resignation. A single gas lamp burned at the far end, its flame steady but subdued, casting shadows that appeared older than the objects which made them. The air held the faint scent of dust and extinguished fire, the honest smell of a house that had learned to endure rather than impress. Mr. Jonathan Fairley stood a few steps from the table, his coat still buttoned, his hat not yet set aside. He had been preparing to leave. His watch lay open in his palm, its ticking measured and untroubled, when the knock at the door interrupted him. It was a modest knock, neither hurried nor apologetic, the sound of someone who believed they had arrived at precisely the correct moment. When Mr. Fairley opened the door, the street offered him nothing but fog and lamplight. The parcel sat alone upon the threshold. It was wrapped in brown paper and secured with string that had been tied carefully, even respectfully. The edges were worn, the paper creased, as though it had passed through several hands without ever being mishandled. This was not the work of a careless courier. Whoever had carried it had done so with intention. Mr. Fairley stepped into the street and looked both ways along Blackthorn Street. The cobblestones glistened faintly beneath the lamps, reflecting their amber glow in muted patches. No carriage moved away in the distance. No retreating footsteps disturbed the fog. The city, which was rarely silent, offered no explanation. He brought the parcel inside and closed the door. Only then did he see the writing. His name had been written clearly, without flourish. Mr. Jonathan Fairley, Blackthorn Street. No, 17. The handwriting was steady, deliberate, and unmistakably familiar. He did not reach for the string at once. Instead, he removed his gloves and placed them carefully beside the parcel, as though observing a formality he could not quite explain. His expression, ordinarily composed to the point of severity, betrayed a slight tightening about the eyes. It had been years since he had last seen that hand, long enough for him to believe he never would again. Mr. Fairley was not a man given to sentiment. He preferred order, precision, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing where each thing belonged. He paid his bills promptly, answered his letters thoroughly, and kept his past in a condition he found acceptable, neatly arranged, rarely visited, and firmly closed. The parcel did not belong to that arrangement. Turning it over, he searched for a return address and found none. Only a wax seal held the knot in place, its surface dulled by time and handling. Pressed faintly into the wax was a small crescent-shaped mark, imperfect and uneven, as though the seal itself had been made without concern for appearances. Mr. Fairley recognized it at once. It had once belonged to a man who prided himself on such imperfections, a man whose handwriting he had learned to recognize under far different circumstances, a man who, according to the city records and the modest stone in Highgate Cemetery, had been dead for nearly 3 years. Mr. Fairley closed his hand around the parcel, feeling the resistance of whatever lay within, not heavy, but solid, deliberate, something meant to be kept intact until the proper moment. If there was such a moment, he carried the parcel into the sitting room where the fire had burned low and placed it upon the desk beneath the window. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass, blurring the line between the house and the street beyond, as though the city itself were reluctant to intrude upon what was about to unfold. For a long while, Mr. Jonathan Fairley simply stood there, listening to the steady ticking of the clock on the mantel. It occurred to him, with a clarity he did not welcome, that some messages do not arrive when they are sent. They arrive when they are needed. There are few things more unsettling than recognizing a person in their absence. Mr. Jonathan Fairley did not need to read a name to know who had written upon the parcel. The slope of the letters, the deliberate spacing, the slight hesitation before each capital, these were habits formed over years, not imitated. They belonged to a man who had once sat at this very desk, who had leaned forward with ink-stained fingers and spoken at length about matters he considered unfinished. That man's name was Thomas Calder. It was not a name spoken often on Blackthorn Street. Not now. Not for some time. When it did appear, it was usually confined to the margins of old documents or the quiet recollections of those who had known him briefly and preferred not to recall him closely. Calder had been a man of ideas, not the kind that improved one's circumstances, but the kind that unsettled them. He spoke frequently of causes, legacies, and obligations that extended beyond the convenience of the living. He had believed, quite sincerely, that a person's influence did not end at the grave, but merely changed its method. Mr. Fairley had once admired that conviction. He did not admire it now. He sat at the desk and drew the parcel closer, resting his hand upon it without yet attempting to open it. The clock continued its steady progress on the mantel, marking time with an indifference that felt almost deliberate. Calder had arrived in Mr. Fairley's life some 12 years earlier, introduced through a mutual acquaintance whose name neither of them later remembered. At the time, Fairley had been newly settled in Blackthorn Street, eager to establish himself as a man of reliability and discretion. Calder, by contrast, had seemed already established in matters that defied such qualities. He had spoken freely, too freely perhaps, of things observed and not recorded, of letters intercepted, documents misplaced, conversations overheard and carefully retained. He possessed, even then, a habit of collecting fragments, not for their immediate usefulness, but for the possibility of future relevance. "You never know," Calder had once said, leaning back in this same chair, "which small thing will become essential when the larger ones fail." Mr. Fairley rose from the desk and crossed to the window. The fog outside had thickened, pressing against the glass, as though curious. Somewhere in the distance, a carriage passed, its wheels muffled, its presence brief. The city continued as it always did, indifferent to the private disturbances of its inhabitants. When Calder had died, the circumstances had been unremarkable. No scandal, no public inquiry. A modest illness, a quiet decline, and a burial attended by fewer people than might have been expected, given the number of lives he had intersected. Mr. Fairley had attended the service. He remembered the weather with uncomfortable clarity. Grey, but not cold. the sort of day that gave no reason for haste. He remembered thinking, as the coffin was lowered, that Calder would have found the scene unsatisfactory, too final, too conclusive. "You place far too much faith in endings," Calder had once remarked, when Fairley had expressed relief at the conclusion of a difficult matter. "Most things merely pause." The parcel now resting upon the desk suggested that Calder had been correct. Returning to his seat, Mr. Fairley examined the knot more closely. The string had been tied in a manner that required no cutting, a deliberate choice. Calder had disliked unnecessary damage, particularly when it came to objects that had served a purpose. He loosened the string slowly and set it aside. The paper fell away without resistance, revealing a smaller box beneath dark wood, polished but not ornate. It bore no markings save for a narrow seam along the lid. The wood was cool beneath his fingers and heavier than he had expected. For a moment, he hesitated. It would be inaccurate to say he feared what lay inside. Fear implies anticipation. This was something closer to recognition, the quiet understanding that once opened, certain things cannot be returned to their previous state. He opened the box. Inside lay a bundle of papers, bound with a faded ribbon, and beneath them, an object wrapped in cloth. The papers were yellowed with age, their edges uneven, as though assembled from various sources rather than produced together. The ribbon had once been blue. Mr. Fairley lifted the bundle first. The top page bore no heading, only a date, written in Calder's familiar hand, and beneath it, a single line, "For when the matter can no longer be avoided." Mr. Fairley closed his eyes briefly. Calder had always possessed an irritating talent for phrasing. He replaced the papers and turned his attention to the wrapped object. The cloth, when unfolded, revealed a small metal key, plain, unadorned, its surface worn smooth by use. It was not the key itself that drew his attention, but the fact that he recognized it, not the shape, the weight. It was the weight of a key that had been carried often and returned reluctantly. Mr. Fairley sat back, the chair creaking softly beneath him, and allowed himself for the first time since the parcel's arrival to acknowledge a truth he had long avoided. Calder had not sent this parcel because he expected Mr. Fairley to want it. He had sent it because he believed Mr. Fairley would need it. And if Calder had been correct about that, then the matter at hand was not merely delayed, it was inevitable. Mr. Jonathan Fairley did not examine the papers at once. That restraint, it must be said, was characteristic of him. He had long believed that haste, more than ignorance, was responsible for most errors of judgment. Calder, by contrast, had possessed an enthusiasm for immediacy, a belief that delay was merely another form of avoidance. It was this difference, more than any disagreement of opinion, that had eventually separated them. The papers remained on the desk, neatly bound, while Mr. Fairley rose and crossed the room. He added a single piece of coal to the fire and watched as the flame responded, briefly brightening before settling into a steady glow. The sitting room, with its familiar proportions and modest furnishings, appeared unchanged. Yet he felt acutely that something within it had shifted. He had lived in Blackthorn Street long enough to know that houses, like people, retained impressions. Conversations lingered, decisions echoed, the walls remembered what their occupants would rather forget. Returning to the desk, he picked up the bundle at last. The pages had not been written consecutively. Dates varied. Some entries were separated by weeks, others by months. Calder's hand remained consistent throughout, firm, deliberate, and unmistakably confident, but the tone of the writing shifted subtly from page to page. There was, at first, an air of curiosity, then caution, Finally, something approaching insistence. Mr. Fairley read without interruption. The papers did not describe a crime, not precisely, nor did they accuse any one individual of wrongdoing. Instead, they chronicled a series of observations, transactions noted but not recorded, meetings that occurred outside official hours, documents that passed briefly through hands unaccustomed to scrutiny. Names appeared. Some were unfamiliar, others were not. Mr. Fairley stopped at the mention of one in particular. It was a name he had encountered only once before, spoken quietly and never repeated. A man of apparent respectability, whose position depended largely upon the perception of reliability. Calder had written the name carefully, as though aware that it possessed a weight disproportionate to its length. The final page bore no date. Its contents were shorter than the rest. If this reaches you, it means I was correct in my assessment of time. The matter could not be concluded during my lifetime. It will attempt to resolve itself through you. Mr. Fairley set the papers down. He did not need to read further to understand Calder's intention. This was not a request for assistance, nor an appeal to conscience. It was an assumption one made with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to being proven right after his objections had been dismissed. The key remained where it had been placed, catching the firelight along its worn edges. Mr. Fairley lifted it between his fingers. He turned it once, then again, feeling its familiar resistance. It was not heavy enough to belong to a door of importance, nor was it small enough to secure a mere drawer. It was the sort of key that served a secondary purpose, access not meant for daily use, but essential when circumstances required discretion. He knew at once where it did not belong. It did not belong to Blackthorn House. That knowledge narrowed the field considerably. Mr. Fairley moved to the small cabinet beside the bookcase and unlocked it. Inside lay several items he rarely acknowledged. Deeds no longer relevant, correspondence carefully retained and never answered, and a leather-bound notebook whose pages remained stubbornly blank. He added the papers to the cabinet, hesitating only briefly before placing the key atop them. The cabinet was closed and locked again. For a time, he stood there, his hand resting on the polished wood. It would have been possible, even then, to leave matters as they were. Calder's documents could remain unread beyond what had already been revealed. The key could remain unused. The parcel, having been opened, could still be effectively ignored. Mr. Fairley was well aware of the advantages of inaction, and yet he had learned something over the years that Calder, for all his urgency, had understood far earlier. Some matters do not tolerate neglect. They persist. The following morning arrived without incident. The city resumed its customary pace, and Blackthorn Street gave no indication that it had been host to anything out of the ordinary. Mr. Fairley attended to his affairs as usual. He wrote his letters, reviewed his accounts, and conducted himself with the quiet efficiency for which he was known. But as the afternoon waned, he found his attention drifting repeatedly to the locked cabinet. By evening, he had made a decision he did not trouble himself to announce. He retrieved the key and placed it in the inner pocket of his coat. The destination, once acknowledged, required no deliberation. It lay several streets away, in a part of the city that had once been prominent and was now merely serviceable. A building not entirely forgotten, but seldom discussed. One that had changed its function without ever truly altering its purpose. The Office of Records. Mr. Fairley had not visited it in many years. When he stepped into the street, the fog had returned, gathering along the pavement with renewed determination. Gas lamps flickered to life one by one, illuminating the path ahead with cautious consistency. He walked without haste. He had learned, after all, that arriving late was not always a failure of timing. Sometimes It was the only option remaining. The Office of Records occupied a narrow building set back from the street, its facade neither imposing nor inviting. It had once served as a counting house, later as a clerk's residence, and finally settled into its present role with the quiet resignation of a place that had outlived its original purpose. Mr. Jonathan Fairley paused before the door, more out of habit than hesitation. The brass plate beside the handle bore no decorative flourish. Only the words "Municipal Records" had been etched into its surface, the lettering worn smooth by decades of indifferent attention. Fairley noted, with some irony, that the sign had aged more honestly than many of the documents kept within. Inside, the air was dry and faintly metallic, tinged with dust and old ink. Rows of shelves lined the walls, their contents arranged with an order that suggested care without affection. Lamps burned steadily above long desks where clerks sat hunched over ledgers, their pens moving with practiced indifference. No one looked up as Fairley entered. This, too, was as it should be. The Office of Records had long cultivated an atmosphere in which visitors were acknowledged only after they had proved themselves persistent. Fairley removed his hat and proceeded toward the counter at the far end of the room. A man of middle years stood there, examining a document through a pair of spectacles that appeared to magnify nothing so much as his own suspicion. "May I assist you?" the man asked, without warmth or discourtesy. "I believe you may," Fairley replied, producing the key from his pocket and placing it upon the counter. "I was told some years ago that this would one day prove useful here." The clerk regarded the key briefly, then shifted his gaze to Fairley's face. There was no recognition in his expression, but there was a flicker of something else, not surprise, but confirmation. He reached beneath the counter and retrieved a small metal tray into which he placed the key. Then, without comment, he turned and moved toward a door at the rear of the room. "Follow me," he said. The passage beyond the door was narrow and poorly lit, its walls lined with shelves that held boxes of uniform size and color. Each bore a label, written in a careful hand, and each appeared to have been consulted far less frequently than it had been filed. The clerk stopped before a door set flush with the wall. There was no number upon it, only a faint crescent-shaped mark carved shallowly into the wood. Mr. Fairley felt a tightening in his chest that he did not trouble himself to examine. The clerk inserted the key. It turned easily. The room beyond was smaller than Fairley had expected, though no less deliberate in its arrangement. Shelves lined every wall, filled not with ledgers, but with folders, each bound in plain string and marked only by a date. A single desk occupied the center of the room, its surface bare, save for a lamp and a thin stack of papers. The clerk gestured toward the desk. 10 minutes, he said. "No copies, no notes. What you read stays here." Fairley inclined his head. The clerk departed, closing the door behind him with a sound that suggested finality without emphasis. Alone, Fairley approached the desk. The topmost paper bore a familiar name, not his own, nor Calder's. It was the name Calder had underlined in his notes, written again here with a firmness that suggested official acknowledgement rather than personal suspicion. Beneath it lay a series of dates, each corresponding to a transaction, a meeting, or a document that had never reached its intended destination. Fairley read quickly now. The pattern was unmistakable. Calder had not been uncovering a single matter, but tracing the outline of a system, one that relied upon discretion, delay, and the assumption that most people would prefer not to know how things were truly arranged. At the bottom of the page, a single sentence had been added in a different hand. "File incomplete. Further inquiry discouraged." Fairley closed his eyes briefly. Calder had never responded well to discouragement. The second page detailed a change subtle but significant. Documents once delayed had begun to disappear entirely. Records altered, names removed. The machinery Calder had observed had not merely continued, it had refined itself. Fairley's time was nearly spent. He replaced the papers precisely as he had found them and extinguished the lamp. When he opened the door, the clerk was waiting, his expression unchanged. "That will be all," the man said, retrieving the key and returning it to Fairley. "I imagine you will not require this room again." Fairley did not contradict him. Outside, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing the street in sharper detail. He walked home with measured steps, the key heavy in his pocket despite its modest size. Calder had not sent the parcel to reveal the truth. He had sent it to confirm it. And in doing so, he had transferred something far less tangible than documents or keys. He had transferred responsibility. Mr. Jonathan Fairley did not return directly to Blackthorn Street. Instead, he walked past it. This deviation, slight though it was, marked the first conscious alteration he had made to his habits in many years. He crossed into neighbouring streets where the lamps burned a little lower and the houses bore the signs of compromise rather than decay. These were streets where people lived not because they wished to, but because circumstances had learned how to keep them there. Fairley walked with his collar turned up, not against the cold but against recognition. It was not paranoia that guided him, but experience. Calder had once remarked that once a man notices a pattern, the pattern has often already noticed him in return. At length, Fairley stopped before a narrow shopfront set between a pawnbroker and a stationer. The sign above the door bore a name few still remembered: Whitcomb and Sons, surveyors and appraisers. The lettering had faded unevenly, suggesting alterations rather than neglect. Inside, the shop smelled faintly of paper, varnish, and something metallic beneath both. Shelves rose to the ceiling, filled with rolled maps, folded deeds, and bound volumes whose spines revealed dates rather than titles. A man emerged from behind the counter as Fairley entered. He was tall, thin, and possessed of a manner that suggested he noticed more than he acknowledged. "Mr. Fairley," the man said, "it has been some time." "So it has," Fairley replied. "I trust my absence has not been inconvenient." The man smiled slightly. "Absence rarely is. Return, however, can be." His name was Arthur Whitcomb, and though the shop bore his family's name, its true purpose extended well beyond the appraisal of property. Whitcomb had once assisted Calder in matters that required both discretion and documentation, the sort of assistance that left no obvious trace. Fairley removed his gloves and placed them upon the counter. "I have come across something," he said. Whitcomb did not ask what. Instead, he nodded toward a small room at the back of the shop. "Then we had best speak where the shelves listen less closely." The room was sparsely furnished: a table, 2 chairs, and a lamp whose light revealed more dust than it concealed. Fairley produced the papers Calder had sent, laying them out carefully. Whitcomb examined them without touching, his eyes moving steadily across the pages. "You know what these imply," Whitcomb said at last. "I do, and you understand," Whitcomb continued, "that understanding them does not grant you protection." Fairley met his gaze. Protection was never implied. Whitcomb studied him for a moment longer, then reached for one of the papers, lifting it delicately. "This is why Calder died," he said. Fairley did not respond. Whitcomb set the paper down. "Not directly, but inevitably." That word again. Whitcomb leaned back in his chair. Calder believed that systems collapse when sufficiently illuminated. What he failed to consider was that some systems adapt to light by changing its direction. What do you advise? Fairly asked. Wickham smiled, though there was no humor in it. I advise nothing. Advice implies influence. I will, however, observe that the men named here do not act alone. They rely upon intermediaries, clerks, messengers, men whose loyalty is purchased in increments, and such men can be approached. They can, Wickham agreed, but they rarely appreciate being noticed. Fairly gathered the papers and stood. Calder believed I would need this information, he said. I am beginning to understand why. I have to. Wickham rose as well. Calder believed many things. Some of them were correct. As Fairley left the shop, the street had darkened further. The lamps burned with renewed effort, and the fog had begun its slow return. He walked now with a different awareness, attentive not to pursuit but to coincidence. By the time he reached Blackthorn Street, the house at number 17 appeared unchanged. This, too, he noted. Inside, he removed his coat and set it aside. The sitting room welcomed him with its familiar stillness. The fire reduced once more to embers. He crossed to the cabinet and retrieved the wooden box from the parcel. From within, he removed the key again, and beneath it, something he had not yet examined, a folded sheet of paper, separate from the others. It bore no date, only a single line, written in Calder's hand with unusual care. Begin with the messenger. Mr. Fairley folded the paper slowly. At last, Calder's intention had ceased to be abstract. Somewhere in the city, there was a man who carried messages he did not read, delivered instructions he did not question, and believed himself safely unnoticed. Mr. Fairley extinguished the lamp and stood in the darkness for a moment, considering the weight of that assumption. Tomorrow, he would begin. Morning arrived in Blackthorn Street with a restraint that bordered on courtesy. The fog withdrew just enough to allow the houses to see one another, though none appeared inclined to acknowledge the fact. Mr. Jonathan Fairley breakfasted lightly, more out of habit than appetite, and reviewed the contents of the wooden box once more before leaving the house. He did not carry the papers with him. Calder had always insisted that information travelled best when it was not accompanied by proof. Proof invited scrutiny. Knowledge, by contrast, invited discretion. The messenger Calder referred to was not difficult to identify. Men who make a profession of carrying messages without curiosity develop certain habits. They avoid eye contact. They arrive early and depart quickly. They are punctual without enthusiasm. Calder had once described them as men who treated the city like a corridor rather than a destination. Fairley found his man near the river, just beyond a warehouse whose name had been painted over more times than the bricks beneath it had been repaired. The man stood beside a handcart, adjusting the straps of a leather satchel that had been polished smooth by years of use. He was unremarkable in every way that mattered. Fairley approached without haste. "Good morning," he said. The man looked up, nodded once, and returned his attention to the satchel. "You carry messages," Fairley continued. "Sometimes documents." And quote. The man paused, then straightened. "I carry parcels," he replied. "What's inside is not my concern." An admirable policy. The man studied Fairley briefly. "If you have business, speak plainly." Fairley produced a coin and held it between his fingers, not offering it yet. "I am interested in a parcel delivered last autumn. Brown paper, no return address. I having Sina." The man's eyes flicked briefly toward the river. Fairley noted the movement. "That parcel was not unusual," the man said. "I deliver many." "And yet," Fairley replied, "you remember this one?" The man hesitated. Fairly placed the coin upon the card. I am not asking you to remember names, only routes. The man took the coin. It went to an office, he said, near the records, not inside, adjacent. And the sender? The man shook his head, dead when I received it. That admission came too easily. Fairly inclined his head. Who paid you? The messenger frowned. That was not the arrangement. Arrangements change. The messenger glanced about, then leaned closer. A clerk, he said quietly, middle-aged, well-dressed, paid in advance. Fairly thanked him and stepped away. It was enough. He did not pursue the clerk. Not yet. Instead, he walked the length of the river, considering what Calder had understood, and Fairly was only now beginning to accept. The system did not depend upon secrecy. It depended upon habit. That evening, as Fairly returned to Blackthorn Street, he sensed for the first time that his movements were being noted, not followed precisely, but observed in passing, the sort of attention that could be denied convincingly if confronted. Inside the house, he paused before lighting the lamp. Someone had been there. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing was missing. And yet the room bore the faint impression of inspection, as though its contents had been evaluated rather than examined. Fairly lit the lamp and crossed to the desk. Upon it lay his gloves. He was certain he had not left them there. Beneath them, a small card, no writing, only a crescent-shaped mark pressed faintly into the paper. Fairly stood very still. Calder had been right about one thing above all others. The moment you begin, you announce yourself. Mr. Jonathan Fairly did not sleep that night. This was not, at first, because of fear. Fear is noisy, insistent, and inclined to dramatics. What kept him awake was something quieter, a persistent awareness, as steady and unyielding as the ticking of the clock in the hall. The house was no longer neutral. He lay still, listening. The familiar sounds of Blackthorn Street filtered faintly through the windows. A distant carriage, the measured steps of a constable, the low murmur of a city that never truly rested. Nothing suggested intrusion, and yet the impression remained. When dawn came, it arrived without relief. Fairly rose early and moved through the house with deliberate care, noting what had changed and, more importantly, what had not. The locks were intact, the windows unaltered, no drawers disturbed, no papers displaced. Whoever had entered had done so with an understanding of restraint. In the sitting room, the wooden box lay exactly where he had left it. He opened it and removed the contents one by one, placing them upon the desk. The papers, the key, the folded note bearing Calder's instruction, and beneath them all, an object he had not yet examined closely. It was a small notebook, leather-bound, plain, and thin enough to be concealed within a coat. Its pages were unnumbered, its cover unmarked, and Calder's handwriting appeared nowhere upon it. At first glance, it seemed empty. Fairly opened it and discovered that this impression was deliberate. The pages bore faint impressions of writing that had once been their indentations left by pressure rather than ink. Calder had written, erased, and preserved only the trace. Fairly retrieved a pencil and shaded lightly across the page. Words emerged, not sentences. Lists, times, locations, initials. He turned the page and repeated the process. More impressions revealed themselves, each page building upon the last. Patterns formed, not obvious ones, but consistent. A network mapped not by names, but by routine. Calder had not been collecting evidence. He had been charting behavior. Fairly closed the notebook. It was then he noticed the smell. Not strong, not alarming, but unfamiliar, a faint trace of oil and metal that did not belong to the house. He followed it down the hall, his steps measured, his expression unchanged. The study door stood ajar. Inside, the desk had been moved, only slightly, just enough to suggest intent. Fairly approached and saw, upon the polished surface, a single object, a coin. It was not his, nor was it recent. The metal bore the wear of circulation long ceased. He recognized it at once, not from its value, but from its history. It had once belonged to Calder. Calder had carried it as a habit, not a keepsake, a marker of sorts. He had used it to indicate agreement without conversation. Fairly picked it up. This was not a warning. It was an acknowledgement. He returned the coin to the desk and extinguished the lamp. By mid-morning, he had made his decision. There would be no more solitary movement. The system, having noticed him, had adjusted its posture. It would now begin to apply pressure. Fairly would respond in kind. He left the house with the notebook concealed beneath his coat and walked toward Whitcomb and Sons once more. The streets felt different now, narrower, more attentive. He did not look for watchers, knowing better than to invite them. Whitcomb greeted him without surprise. "You've been entered," Whitcomb said simply. "Yes," Fairly replied. "And so have you." Whitcomb exhaled slowly. Calder always believed it would come to this. He believed many things, Fairly said. This time, he prepared. Fairly placed the notebook on the table and explained what he had discovered. Whitcomb listened without interruption, his expression growing more severe with each page revealed. "This isn't exposure," Whitcomb said at last. "It's leverage. It's survival," Fairly corrected. Whitcomb nodded. "Then you will need more than one messenger." Fairly allowed himself a thin smile. "I believe I already have." Whitcomb raised an eyebrow. Fairly closed the notebook. "The system depends upon men who look away. I intend to give them something they cannot. It is a common mistake to assume that loss announces itself loudly. In truth, it often arrives quietly, arranging itself among familiar things until it is noticed only by its absence. Mr. Jonathan Fairly discovered his loss in the early afternoon. He had returned to Blackthorn Street earlier than expected, not out of caution but calculation. Predictability, Calder had once observed, was a courtesy extended to one's adversaries. Fairly entered the house and sensed at once that something had shifted again. This time, the house did not pretend otherwise. The cabinet beside the bookcase stood open. Fairly approached slowly. The lock had not been forced. The door had not been damaged. Whoever had opened it possessed either the key or a knowledge that rendered keys unnecessary. Inside, the papers remained. The key remained. The notebook did not. Fairly closed the cabinet and stood very still. The absence of the notebook was not merely inconvenient, it was instructive. The system had not taken everything. It had taken what mattered most. Calder's map was no longer his alone. Fairly sat at the desk and considered what that meant. The notebook had never been intended as proof. Its value lay in interpretation. In the wrong hands, it was meaningless. In the right ones, it was dangerous. And now, someone else would attempt to read it. That evening, the knock came again. Not at the front door. At the study window, Fairly extinguished the lamp and waited. The knock repeated, once more, then ceased. After a moment, a shape resolved itself beyond the glass. A man standing close, his outline distorted by the reflection of the street lamp behind him. Fairly opened the window slightly. "You have something that belongs to me," the man said. His voice was calm, professional, and entirely unthreatening. "You are mistaken," Fairly replied. "You have something that belongs to the dead." The man smiled faintly. Dead men rarely require their possessions. Some do, Fairley said. They simply lack the opportunity to reclaim them. The man leaned closer. You have been reading things that were not meant to be read. So have you. That gave the man pause. Return the notebook, Fairley said. It will not serve you. The man shook his head. It already has. Fairley studied him carefully. This was not a messenger, nor a clerk. This was someone accustomed to ensuring that messages were not misunderstood. You are not here to threaten me, Fairley said. If you were, I would not be speaking to you now. The man inclined his head. Correct. Then you are here to inform me. Yes. Of what? That the system has considered your involvement, the man replied, and has found it inconvenient. Inconvenient is survivable. The man smiled again. So is irrelevance. Fairley closed the window. The man did not attempt to stop him. The following day, Whitcomb did not open his shop. The shutters were drawn, the sign removed. No notice was posted. Fairley stood across the street and understood at once what had been taken from him. Not the notebook. Time. Whitcomb had been removed from the board, whether temporarily or permanently remained unclear. Fairley returned home with a certainty that settled heavily upon him. The system did not punish immediately. It rearranged. That night, Fairley removed the remaining contents of the wooden box and placed them into a satchel. He left the house with nothing that could not be replaced. Blackthorn Street watched him go without comment. Calder had once said that a man's true position is revealed not by what he possesses, but by what he is permitted to lose. Mr. Jonathan Fairley was no longer being permitted anything. There is a peculiar danger in speaking a name that has been kept deliberately unspoken. Mr. Jonathan Fairley understood this well enough to avoid it for as long as possible. Names have a way of gathering attention, of aligning themselves with intentions, whether those intentions are declared or not. Calder had known this. Whitcomb had known it too. But Fairley was now operating without either of them. He spent the morning walking, not wandering, but moving with purpose, disguised as habit. He crossed streets he had not visited in years, entered shops where he had never been a customer, and paused in places that offered neither comfort nor concealment. He was not searching for someone. He was allowing himself to be seen. By midday, the city responded. It began subtly. A man stepped aside too late. A carriage slowed without reason. A clerk lingered near a doorway longer than was necessary. None of these actions could be confronted. All of them could be remembered. Fairley entered a small public house near the market, one of the older establishments whose walls had absorbed enough conversation to render any single one unremarkable. He ordered a modest meal and sat alone at a table near the back. The man who joined him did so without asking. "You are persistent," the man said. Fairley did not look up. "Persistence is often mistaken for confidence, and confidence," the man replied, "is often misplaced." Fairley met his gaze then. He recognized him at once, not from sight, but from manner. This was the man who had stood at his window, the one who informed rather than threatened. "I wish to speak plainly," Fairley said. "So do I," the man replied, "which is why I advise against it." Fairley reached into his coat and removed the coin Calder had left behind. He placed it on the table between them. "You recognize this?" Fairley said. The man glanced at it briefly, then nodded. "I do. It belonged to Thomas Calder." The man did not react. "And before Calder," Fairley continued, "it belonged to Mr. Elias Morrow." The effect was immediate. The man's hand moved, not toward the coin, but away from it. His expression did not change, but something behind it did. Fairley had seen the same shift in men confronted with unexpected accuracy. You should not say that name, the man said quietly. And yet, Fairly replied, it appears someone already has. The man rose. That name does not concern you. It concerns everyone, Fairly said, who relies upon the disappearance of records. The man leaned closer. You have made an error. Yes, Fairly agreed. I have. The man straightened. Then this conversation is concluded. It was concluded the moment the notebook was taken, Fairly replied. The man left without another word. Fairly finished his meal. By the time he stepped back into the street, the atmosphere had altered. Not dramatically. No pursuit followed him. No accusation was made. But the city's indifference had sharpened into attention. He returned not to Blackthorn Street, but to a modest lodging house several streets away one Calder had once recommended, in the event of administrative inconvenience. The room was small, clean, and temporary by design. That night, Fairly wrote a letter. He did not address it. He did not sign it. He listed only dates, initials, and locations drawn from memory, from Calder's papers, from the impressions the notebook had left behind. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and placed it into an envelope. Then he wrote the name again, Elias Morrow. The letter was placed beneath the floorboard, where it would not be found quickly, nor, he hoped, too late. Fairly lay down on the narrow bed and closed his eyes. He had spoken the name aloud. The system would respond. The only question now was how many people would be listening when it did. The response did not come immediately. Mr. Jonathan Fairly had expected that much. Systems of the sort Calder had uncovered rarely acted in haste. Their strength lay in calibration, in determining precisely how much pressure was required and where it would be most effective. It was 3 days after the name had been spoken that the city answered. Fairly noticed first the absence of coincidence. The lodging house remained quiet. No unfamiliar footsteps paused outside his door. No sudden inquiries were made of the proprietor. Even the streets appeared to have resumed their ordinary indifference. This, he knew, was deliberate. On the 4th morning, a letter arrived. It was slipped beneath the door, without ceremony. No knock accompanied it. No attempt was made to announce its presence. The envelope was plain, the paper of good quality, but unmarked. Inside was a single sheet. No greeting, no signature, only an address Fairly recognized at once. It belonged to a building that no longer officially existed. The structure stood of that he was certain, but its designation had been altered, its purpose revised, and its history carefully compressed into irrelevance. Once a private exchange house, then briefly a municipal annex, it now served as little more than storage. It was also where Calder had once believed certain things were held temporarily. Fairly folded the letter and placed it into his coat. This was not a threat. It was an invitation. He arrived just before dusk. The building occupied a narrow corner lot, its windows dark, its entrance recessed slightly from the street. A single lamp burned above the door, casting a light that did little to reassure. Fairly entered without hesitation. Inside, the space had been cleared of furniture. The walls bore the marks of removal rather than neglect. Footsteps echoed with a precision that suggested the room had been prepared for sound. "You came," a voice said. The man stepped forward from the shadows. He was older than Fairly had expected, not aged, but seasoned, a man whose authority had been earned quietly and retained deliberately. "You wish to speak," Fairly replied. "We wish to observe," the man corrected. "You have," Fairly said, "and now you will respond." The man smiled faintly. "You misunderstand. This is the response. He gestured toward a table at the far end of the room. Upon it lay an object Fairly recognized instantly. The notebook. It had been opened, examined, marked. You see, the man continued, you possess fragments. Calder always preferred fragments. What he never accepted was that fragments invite completion. Fairly approached the table. You have not understood it, he said. On the contrary, the man replied, we understand it perfectly. What you mistake for a map is merely an index. And yet, Fairly said, you felt compelled to return it. The man's smile thinned. We felt compelled to show you something. He lifted the notebook and turned it toward Fairly. Several pages bore new impressions. Not Calder's, not Fairly's. These, the man said, are corrections. Fairly looked up. Then you admit alteration. We acknowledge maintenance. Fairly nodded slowly. Then Calder was closer to the truth than you prefer. The man regarded him carefully. Calder believed exposure would end us. He believed accountability would. The man laughed quietly. You are an intelligent man, Mr. Fairly. That is why you have not yet been removed. Yet, Fairly repeated. The man's expression hardened slightly. You have one remaining courtesy, and that is to leave. Fairly met his gaze. With the notebook, the man considered this, then nodded. You may take it. Why? Because, the man replied, it will not help you in the way you believe. Fairly took the notebook. As he turned to leave, the man spoke once more. You should not have spoken the name. Fairly paused. No, he said. But someone else should have. Long ago, outside, the fog had returned. Fairly walked without haste, the notebook held firmly beneath his arm. He did not yet know whether he had gained ground or merely confirmed the limits of it. But one thing was now certain. The system had acknowledged him, and acknowledgement, once given, cannot be withdrawn. Mr. Jonathan Fairly did not return to the lodging house immediately. Instead, he walked, not because he feared being followed, but because the city, when traversed without urgency, had a habit of clarifying one's thoughts. The fog thinned as he crossed into streets where commerce still lingered after dusk, and the notebook beneath his arm seemed to grow heavier with each step. He did not open it until he was certain he was alone. The room he had chosen was small and unremarkable, furnished only with a desk, a chair, and a lamp, whose light revealed more than it softened. Fairly placed the notebook upon the desk and regarded it for a long moment, as one might regard a familiar face that had aged unexpectedly. He opened it. The first pages were unchanged. Calder's impressions emerged beneath the pencil, just as before: times, initials, locations. But further on, the rhythm altered. New indentations appeared, sharper, more deliberate. These were not the marks of recording, but of revision. Names had been added, not full names, never full names. Initials paired with symbols, some of which Fairly recognized at once, others he did not. He understood then what the man in the warehouse had meant. These were not corrections of fact. They were corrections of interpretation. Calder had charted behavior. The system had responded by charting influence. Fairly closed the notebook slowly. Calder had never intended this object to expose a conspiracy. Exposure was loud, immediate, and easily contained. No, the notebook had been meant to reveal alignment, to show how small decisions, repeated quietly, created outcomes no single participant could claim responsibility for. And now the system had confirmed it by attempting to overwrite it. Fairly leaned back in his chair. For the first time since the parcel's arrival, he allowed himself a faint smile. They had misunderstood Calder's final intention. The notebook was not the weapon. It was the proof of necessity. Fairly retrieved the folded letter he had written days earlier, the one hidden beneath the floorboard. He had returned earlier that afternoon, carefully, unnoticed, to retrieve it. He unfolded it now and compared its contents to the newly marked pages of the notebook. The alignment was unmistakable. Calder had not been mapping a single system. He had been mapping succession. Fairly realized then that Calder had never expected to finish this work himself, nor had he expected Fairly to complete it either. The parcel had arrived too late because it had been intended to. Calder had been selecting a witness, someone who would survive long enough to be inconvenient. Fairly folded the letter again and placed it into the notebook, sliding it between two pages marked by unfamiliar symbols. He did not yet know who would read it, but he knew they would. Outside, the city continued its steady respiration. Somewhere, a clerk updated a ledger. Somewhere else, a messenger delivered a parcel he would not remember. And elsewhere still, a man like Fairly adjusted his calculations, aware that the margin for error had narrowed. He extinguished the lamp and stood in the darkness, considering the shape of what came next. He would not confront the system again, not directly. That was Calder's error. Instead, he would allow it to complete itself. For a time, nothing happened. This was not negligence, nor hesitation. It was design. Mr. Jonathan Fairly resumed a version of his former life, careful to ensure it resembled the original closely enough to satisfy casual observation. He returned to Blackthorn Street at measured intervals, paid visits that required no explanation, and conducted his affairs with the outward regularity of a man who had learned nothing and suspected nothing. The system watched, and, finding no immediate resistance, began to relax. This, Fairly knew, was inevitable. Large mechanisms are intolerant of uncertainty, but they are remarkably patient with familiarity. They assume that what does not interfere is aligned. Calder had written as much in a margin Fairly now recalled with uncomfortable clarity. Silence is often mistaken for consent. Days passed, then weeks. The notebook remained untouched, not because Fairly feared it, but because he respected its timing. It lay concealed, neither protected nor exposed, awaiting a moment that could not be summoned deliberately. In the meantime, Fairly listened. He listened in public houses, in queues, in the casual remarks of men who spoke freely because they believed themselves irrelevant. He learned of a clerk dismissed without cause, of a document misfiled and never recovered, of a small committee quietly dissolved and never reassembled. These were not disasters. They were adjustments. The system, deprived of confrontation, had turned inward. It began to correct itself. Fairly observed these changes with a calm that surprised even him. He felt no urgency to intervene. Calder's error had been impatience, the belief that revelation must be immediate to be effective. Fairly now understood otherwise. A system that is permitted to believe it has won often reveals more in its comfort than it ever would under threat. One evening, as Fairly dined alone in a modest restaurant near the river, he noticed a man seated several tables away. The man did not look at him, nor did he pretend not to. He occupied a careful middle ground, attentive without acknowledgement. This, too, was familiar. Fairly did nothing. The man remained for the duration of the meal, then departed. 2 days later, another appeared, then another. The system had not withdrawn its attention. It had redistributed it. Fairly returned home that night to find a letter waiting for him. Not beneath the door, not delivered by hand. It lay upon the hall table, exactly where the parcel had once rested. The envelope was unmarked. Inside was a single page. No address, no name, only a sentence. "We believe you understand now." Fairly folded the letter and placed it beside the wooden box, which he had kept empty upon the desk. He did not reply. There was nothing to say. Understanding, once achieved, does not require acknowledgement. He slept well that night, better, in fact, than he had since the parcel's arrival. For the first time, he felt aligned not with the system, but with the inevitability Calder had trusted. The following morning, Fairley removed the notebook from its concealment. He did not read it. Instead, he added something to it. Not a name, not a date, a question, written lightly so that it would not be immediately visible. Who inherits this silence? He closed the notebook and returned it to its place. The question would not trouble the system yet, but it would. In time, it was not the system that fractured first. It was a man. Mr. Jonathan Fairley learned this on an unremarkable afternoon, in a place so ordinary that it would never have appeared in Calder's notes. A modest reading room near the municipal offices, frequented by clerks whose ambition had long since learned the value of moderation. Fairley had not come with expectation. Expectation sharpens disappointment. He sat at a long table, leafing through a newspaper whose contents he barely absorbed, when a shadow fell across the page. "You were not meant to return here," a voice said quietly. Fairley looked up. The man standing before him was young, younger than Fairley had anticipated, with the precise posture of someone who had been trained to appear inconspicuous. His coat was well kept, his boots recently polished, and his expression carefully neutral. "You have mistaken me for someone else," Fairley replied. The man did not sit. He did not smile. "I have not," he said, "but I would prefer that others do." Fairley folded the paper and gestured toward the empty chair opposite him. After a moment's hesitation, the man sat. "You work in records," Fairley said, not as a question. The man's jaw tightened slightly. "I assist with classification." "Then you see everything," Fairley replied, "but touch nothing." The man glanced around the room. "You should not have been given access to the annex." "And yet," Fairley said, "I was." Silence followed, not the comfortable kind, but the strained variety that suggests a decision being weighed. "They are changing things," the man said at last. Fairley did not respond. "They always change things," the man continued, "but this time the changes are accelerated. Files removed before replacement, names reassigned too quickly. It is as if they are preparing for absence." "For whose?" Fairley asked. The man hesitated. "For yours," he said. Fairley nodded once. "Then you have come to warn me?" "No," the man replied. "I have come to ask you something." Fairley leaned back slightly. "Ask." The man lowered his voice. "When Thomas Calder realized he would not finish his work, did he know who would?" Fairley regarded him carefully now. Calder had never written this man's name, which meant he had not trusted him, which meant, paradoxically, that he might be trustworthy. "He knew," Fairley said slowly, "that someone would be forced into the position, and that someone was you." For a time, the man swallowed. "And after you?" And Fairley thought of the question he had written into the notebook. Who inherits this silence? He met the man's gaze. "That depends on who survives it." The man's composure faltered, just briefly. "They are planning to close the cycle," he said. "A formal closure. A declaration that the irregularities were administrative errors. Once it is signed, nothing Calder documented can be acted upon." "When?" Fairley asked. "Soon," the man replied. "Days, not weeks." Fairley stood. "Then Calder misjudged one thing," the man said quickly. "Time." "No," Fairley replied. He understood it perfectly. Um, he left the reading room without looking back. That evening, Fairley opened the notebook for the first time in weeks. He did not shade the pages. He did not search for patterns. Instead, he turned to the very last page. It was blank. He wrote a single line. Succession requires witnesses. Then he closed the notebook and placed it back into the wooden box, sealing it carefully. For the first time since the parcel had arrived, Fairley allowed himself to acknowledge the shape of the end that approached. Not exposure, not justice, continuation. Somewhere in the city, a document was being prepared, a signature rehearsed, a silence formalized, and somewhere else, quite unnoticed, the conditions for interruption were being finalized. The document was signed on a Thursday. This detail mattered less for its symbolism than for its convenience. Thursdays were quiet in municipal offices. Senior clerks left early. Committees concluded their business efficiently. The week, having nearly exhausted itself, offered little resistance. Mr. Jonathan Fairley did not attend, nor did he need to. The signing took place in a modest chamber, its walls lined with shelves whose contents had not been consulted in years. The men present spoke little. Each knew his role, and none required reassurance. The document passed from hand to hand, signatures applied with measured strokes, seals impressed with practiced finality. When it was done, the matter was considered closed. Irregularities reclassified as oversights, delays attributed to miscommunication, absences explained by retirement or reassignment. The system, satisfied with its own coherence, resumed its customary rhythm. It did not notice the man standing just outside the chamber. He was not young, nor was he old. His name appeared nowhere on the document. His presence required no explanation. He carried a folder unmarked, unremarkable, and waited patiently until the door reopened. "Is it finished?" he asked. "Yes," one of the men replied. "It is concluded." The man nodded. "Then I will take custody." The folder was handed to him without question. Custody, after all, is a familiar concept in such places. He left the building unremarked. That evening, Mr. Jonathan Fairley walked one final time through Blackthorn Street. Number 17 stood as it always had, its windows dark, its proportions unchanged. He did not enter. There was nothing inside that required him. The house had served its purpose. At a small lodging house several streets away, Fairley sat at a narrow desk and wrote a brief note. It contained no accusations, no revelations, no instructions, only a single sentence. "The silence has been inherited." He folded the note, placed it inside the wooden box, and sealed it carefully. The box was then delivered to a clerk who did not ask questions and would not remember the exchange by morning. Mr. Fairley left the city before dawn. No one marked his departure. No record noted his absence. In time, his name would appear only in registers that were consulted less frequently than they were preserved. And elsewhere, in a reading room not far from the municipal offices, a young man sat alone at a long table. Before him lay a notebook. He shaded the page lightly. Words emerged. Not names, not dates, but alignments. He paused, then turned to the final page. Written there, in a hand he did not recognize, was a question. Who inherits this silence? The young man closed the notebook. Outside, the city continued as it always had: clerks filing papers, messengers delivering parcels, systems adjusting themselves with quiet confidence. Nothing had been exposed. Nothing had collapsed. And yet, somewhere within the machinery, something had changed. Not an ending, a continuation.